President Trump has made clear his desire to acquire Greenland. It's an interesting proposition, but what does it mean for geopolitical relationships, natural mining, and so much more? I'm Maggie McGrath, a senior editor at Forbes, and joining me now to discuss what it could mean and if it's even possible for the US to acquire Greenland is Mike Albertus. He is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
You are also the author of a book called Land Power, where you argue that land is power. So I want to start with a somewhat obvious question. As President Trump in his second term has talked about Greenland, he has made it very clear that he wants this territory, which is part of Denmark. Is this just a power grab? Is this just to make the geographic reach of the US bigger?
I think it's far more than that. It is, in some sense, a power grab, but it's more than just making the United States bigger because there are other, perhaps more complicated or difficult ways of doing that. But Greenland is a very specific way. The proposal to expand the United States through the acquisition of Greenland is a rather specific proposal, and so it's about more than that. It's about, geostrategic interest and minerals and the like as well.
Geostrategic interest and minerals. Let's start with that latter group. We have a resource-rich country here in the US, but is Greenland more resource-rich when it comes to minerals and even rare minerals?
Well, so one thing that's I think really important to understand is that China is now the world's biggest, source and processor of rare earth minerals. And as the tariff, battle with China and strategic competition with China is heating up, it's becoming more difficult for the United States to access critical rare earth minerals for several things, for the transition to, greener tech, things like EVs, for electric vehicles, batteries for EVs, as well as advanced military technology, satellite technology, semiconductors, and the like. So that is a really critical part of this, and there has been a lot of prospecting on Greenland, and it looks like Greenland is a potential source for some of these really, really critical minerals that the U.S. and many other advanced economies depend on, but that the U.S. has a difficult time, acquiring or processing in the continental U.S.
So perhaps, I know it's hard to entirely discern what is going on in any one president's mind, but perhaps the corollary to what we're seeing with the China tariff policy is let's go to Greenland and get some of these materials. Part of this proposal that he's put out there includes a $10,000 annual payment to Greenland's residents. The people who live there, it's roughly 57,000, 60,000 people, give or take, on a given year. Is the economic value that the US could derive from Greenland greater than the sum of those payments?
Definitely. It seems like the answer to that is definitely yes. And, again, there are sort of short-term, medium-term, and longer-term benefits, were the United States actually to acquire it. If you strictly look at sort of the financial flows, separate from, what this might cost to some of our alliances and the like. But if you think about not only access to minerals, which are becoming more available as ice melts on Greenland, but also things like access to strategic shipping lanes that are increasingly going to be used as, the Arctic ice melts and, new shipping routes, particularly at the northern part of Canada and Russia, open up. So those are very valuable kind of, longer term plays. $10,000 a year to Greenlanders is something, but it's not that much. And frankly, it's not that much compared to what they currently get from being as part of Denmark in the EU, right? So they are part of a bigger, broader kind of welfare state as well, and people derive considerable benefits from that.
You've written that Arctic shipping has increased 37% over the last decade, and you were just talking about that Northwest Passage. Can you talk a little bit more about these shipping lanes and how it currently works? Because can the US currently get around Greenland, or is it blocked? Like, what would open up if Greenland were part of the US?
All right. So currently, you can drive ships to Greenland and around Greenland and the like. But there's a seasonality, of course, to Arctic ice, and that season is getting shorter for in terms of ice coverage, particularly at the northern fringes of Canada and Russia, because doing loops around Greenland doesn't get you so much. But if you can connect very different markets in different parts of the world and avoid places like having to ship through the Suez Canal or ship around the Asian subcontinent and things like that, you can start to unlock a lot of value through those very different shipping routes. And so that's what's really critical here. And why Greenland? Well, Greenland is a potential waypoint along both of these shipping routes, the ones that run north of Canada and north of Russia. It's reasonable to think of Greenland as an important waypoint on those shipping routes. And those are long shipping routes too, right? So there would probably be many waypoints along those routes. But if one is going to try and impact the flow of goods through those areas, then having a longer chain of influence or control is going to be very important.
Prior presidents, including President Truman, have tried and failed to acquire Greenland. Is President Trump in his second term better positioned than these past efforts, in your opinion?
Well, that's a difficult question. It depends a lot on what the Trump administration is willing to do, because after all, Denmark has indicated very clearly that it's not interested in selling Greenland. And Greenlanders themselves have indicated, the Prime Minister of Greenland has indicated that this is an aggressive, position from the United States that the United States is taking, and that also it is not interested. It is not up for sale. And so it would require either a very attractive deal on the part of the administration, but also probably some degree of military, projection of military force, which is hard to countenance when one thinks of, the current or what has been for a long time since the end of World War II, sort of global norms around the use of force, as well as things like, the NATO alliance and the like. This would be a huge departure from a lot of that, and would sacrifice, I think, a lot of alliances and goodwill across all of Europe. So it would be a very bold move to do something like this.
It does feel like a huge threat to the NATO alliance, but in his first term and in campaigning for his second, President Trump has made it clear that he's not quite a fan of NATO. What would the ramifications be? Are there specific things that you have in mind as you talk about a shift to the geopolitical world order here?
Well, I think that, you're right in saying that, Trump is not a fan of NATO, but the United States was, of course, a critical architect of NATO, and in many ways has supported NATO materially to a quite substantial degree over the course of decades. And that underpins a lot of how we think about the strategic sort of positioning of Europe and the United States vis-a-vis other powers, particularly Russia, but also other powers more globally. And so, rewiring that alliance would be just a very big departure, be a very big departure from the world order that the United States helped to create in the aftermath of World War II. And it would hark back to, I think, the attempt to acquire Greenland would certainly tear NATO to shreds. And beyond that, it would yield the beginning, I think, and we're already seeing the hints of this, of a new era of territorial competition, where the threats to acquire territory and actual acts to acquire territory are going to become much more common, like they were in, let's say, the 1800s or the like, right? So it will become, it'll be sort of back to the future in that front.
Back to the Future. I saw one commentator say that an American aggressive stance towards acquiring Greenland could change the tenor of the conversation around Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan. Would it effectively hasten what you just described, the Back to the Future, if the US were to aggressively acquire Greenland?
I think that's definitely true. I mean, it's hard to imagine a US that both aggressively acquires Greenland and that is serious about Ukraine's territorial integrity or, Taiwan's sovereignty or the like. And the Trump administration has already made it I think, crystal clear when it comes to, Ukraine's position against Russia, where the United States it stands. It's certainly not squarely on the Ukrainian side, as it has been for the first several years of the war. There's much more of a hands-off position, and let the chips fall where they may to a considerable degree, right? The same is true. I think, China would. I don't see how they could read those sorts of activities in a different way, other than that the United States is attempting to project its authority in ways that are consequential for other global powers, and that it doesn't is not so interested in protecting smaller states, smaller powers, and that Taiwan included in that list.
Now, Mike, you talked about how Denmark has said Greenland is not for sale. Greenlanders have said Greenland is not for sale. Is this perhaps a unifying moment for Greenlanders, and could they make a play for complete and total independence?
Definitely. In many ways, I think this helps to unify Greenlanders around the cause of certainly defending their own territorial integrity and their own autonomy, as not only as, being part, not simply as being part of Denmark, but also being Greenlanders themselves, right? And so, I think public opinion polls have indicated that less than 10% of Greenlanders would consider entertaining a plan to join the United States. So there's quite substantial support for Greenlanders remaining independent, right? It becomes a little bit more of a tricky question, I think, as to whether Greenlanders would prefer full independence from Denmark versus staying with Denmark. On the one hand, it might depend in part on whether you think you might have a greater sort of security shield when you're, part of Denmark and part of the EU still, right? A Greenland going it alone might be a weaker Greenland. So I think that and that was reflected in the recent vote, the recent elections on Greenland as well. I think Greenlanders themselves are still debating and struggling through what's the best position, what's the best footing we can take forward in thinking about this new world in which we have come under threat.
Now, we've had a very serious conversation about the prospect of the US acquiring Greenland, which I have to say, during President Trump's first administration, first term, it was more of a punchline when he brought it up then. And he did bring it up in his first term. Obviously, a lot has happened between his first term and second term, including a whole pandemic. But from a geopolitical lens and from your expert lens, what has changed between that first term and now that suddenly the US acquiring Greenland isn't a joke as much as it is a policy discussion that you and I are having?
I think part of it is this race, this global race for accessing and securing rare earth minerals. So that's something that's really critical. With the transition to AI, and with the transition to greener technology, and the minerals that go into all that are really quite quite a substantial requirement in terms of the minerals front for those technologies. And it's becoming, and like I said, China has sort of cornered the market in that. And it's done so over the course of the last decade or so. And so certainly the United States is at a position now where it's kind of scrambling to access a lot of those minerals. So that is one thing I think that has changed. Another thing that has changed is, you mentioned that statistic earlier that, Arctic shipping has increased 37% over the last decade, right? So that is a trend that is anticipated to increase, and at an accelerating rate as well, right? So climate change is real, and whether you want to talk about it or not, the realities, whether on the ground or in the sea, are actually changing. And I think, states are starting to act in their own self-interests around that as they see opportunities, challenges, and the like. And so I think that that's another critical element that's changed. I guess there is also one third one, which is that it's hard to entirely dismiss the role of folks like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and the like, and tech more generally within the Trump administration. And there is definitely a considerable portion of tech billionaires that are advocates of building, sort of a libertarian kind of zone where they can set up business and do things as they like. And Greenland is in that discussion for them as well. And so that's also something that's different.
So, Mike, what will you be watching going forward? There's a lot of geopolitical news right now, including with the tariffs. But when it comes to the Greenland issue specifically, are there signals you're going to be looking for from the administration, or what do the next few weeks or years look like?
Right. So I think that there are, the administration now is taking concrete steps to try and make this something closer to a reality, right? So, there is an ambassador who has been nominated for Denmark, Ken Howry, who is again, close to, people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, whose portfolio is dedicated to the acquisition of Greenland. And so, as watching how that develops and how that the relationship through him to Denmark and the EU develops over the course of the next several months, weeks and months, is going to be critical, I think, to seeing where this goes, as well as what happens with some of the tariff issues, right, and some of the difficulties again in the acquisition of rare earth minerals. And so, if that becomes, if the spillovers from the tariff spat with China have implications for and create shortages of rare earth minerals, then that might again advance this agenda, right? So I think that we're going to see step after step after step that's taken towards this greater goal of Greenland acquisition, and we'll see whether it ultimately gets to that.
Mike Albertus, author of Land Power and a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about the United States and Greenland and geopolitical strategy. We so appreciate your time and insight.
Thanks. It was a pleasure to be here.